Welcome back. I'm sorry the technology crashed on me during the middle of our meditation and had to reboot and sent out the new link. Hopefully you will have been able to get connected soon enough. But if you're now having to follow the recording, my apologies for the problems with the technology. So one of the things I'd like to talk about this evening is something that comes from the very earliest traditions of the Christian Church. In the beginning of the book of Genesis, we are told about the way in which God creates. And it says that God created humanity and in a particular way, a very interesting way, which is not often dwelt on. If we read in the text in Genesis chapter 1, what we find is that God said, "Let us make humankind in our own image." And then it says, and create them in our likeness. And it's often thought in modern theology that these two ideas are kind of the same thing. But when we look in the early Christian tradition, the theologians of the early church, and particularly St. Basil the Great, is very clear that these two ideas are substantially different. On the one hand, God creates humanity in the image of God. And then there is this other aspect that there is some form of creation going on into the likeness of God. So we have the image of God and the likeness of God. And what St. Basil teaches us is that there is a very profound and distinctive difference between these two things that's really, really important to us in our understanding of our place in creation and the nature of our connection, our relationship with God, the Creator. The first of these two things, St. Basil tells us, is this idea of being created in the image of God. And he says that this is something which is entirely within the power and choice of God. So God is the one that creates humanity in God's image. Now, what is that image? Clearly, God is not a being of any kind that has a form and a shape, as everything within created order within the universe has form and shape and a sense of presence, a sense of individuality. That is not the nature of God. God is entirely beyond time and space and has no boundary. So we look then to the way in which God manifests that essence of the divine within creation. And we know this from the form of relationship which God has with created order and especially with the people of Israel. And from that we learn that the image of God is to do with both God's creativity and to do with God's wisdom. And thirdly, to do with God's choice. All of these three things are integrated within the nature of the act of creation. And they explain creation in that sense fully. So we as human beings are given a form of creativity, not just in procreation, but also in terms of our ability to act creatively, both in artistic senses and in technological senses, and in other ways as well, in our capacity to produce stories and all kinds of things like that. So that is our as it were, snippet of the capacity to create. Of course, we can't create in the way that God creates. The other aspect of God's creativity is the notion of wisdom. And we, above all animals within nature, have something very distinctive, and that is a capacity to reason, an intellectual ability to work things out and to explain things. And that is our intellectual version of God's wisdom. We can explain what is. God can explain beyond that. God can explain what isn't. That is why we can't explain God. So the third aspect then of the essence of God is the choice that God makes. And we are told elsewhere in the Christian tradition that humanity is made with free will. As distinct from the angels, who are not made with free will, they are bound to do what angels do. Within humanity, humanity is created with the capacity to make choices. And of course, choices are then to do with value, and value is a position on the spectrum of morality and ethics. So these are the aspects that God has made us capable of. So that is the image of God. But what Basil the Great tells us then is, what is the likeness of God? In a sense, God has given us a capacity to co-create with God. Not in the same way that God creates, but in this particular way. It is through our intellectual capacity that we see that there is a valid reason why we may cooperate with God. That is to say, the engagement of free will and intellectual reason. When we engage free will with intellectual reason, we embark upon a process of co-creation. And what Basil is telling us is that as we engage in this process, we, of our own free choice, choose to cooperate with God in completing God's creation of humanity, and therefore influencing the whole of nature by the results of that cooperation in which we engage. So from the point of view of our capacity to cooperate with God, then, our free will is our means, along with our intellect, our capacity for reason, our means by which we may assist and cooperate with God in fulfilling the entirety of the capacity, the entirety of the potential of our image, the image of God in us. So in a sense, God has left the creation in humanity in some ways incomplete. We are not made perfect, but we may aspire to perfection through our free will and also our intellectual reasoning capacity, which allows us to know the difference between what is good and effective in this respect and what is bad and counterproductive in this respect. And that is where the benefit of Basil's teaching is so important to us, because as we engage in our meditation practice, we are in effect engaged in co-creation with God of ourselves and of nature around us. As we choose, in a different way to the way Adam chose, he chose falsely. If we chose rightly, then we choose to cooperate with God because of our free will. And in our meditation, we choose to meditate, and we choose to keep the sacred word in our mind, and we choose to go back to it each time we notice it's not there. And that process then helps to remove from us all the inherited material which has been loaded on us by our life experience, our growing up, even before our birth, the influence of the world upon us, and what it has made us capable of, and the ways in which we behave, the nature of our character, and of the choices we make. All of these are influenced by our upbringing and by the influence of the world around us. The crucial thing here is what we have failed to notice is that free will is a gift from God and therefore is very powerful. And a lot of the actions and things that we do, which we call sin, are done merely because our ego or our circumstances have caused us to fail to remember or not to realize in the first place that our free will is more powerful than anything else within us, even more powerful than our ego. Now that may come as a surprise because of the way in which we express, or the ego expresses its own will, contrary to what we know the Bible teaches us is a good and moral life. Our ego persuades us that we don't have any free will. It causes us to behave, and we feel that we have no power over it. But actually that's not true. Our free will is more powerful. And when we guide our free will in relationship to cooperating with God, then it becomes very powerful. And this is borne out by the nature of our experiences. If we believe we are forced to fast during Lent, it becomes extremely difficult to do it. We find great struggle. But if we make a spiritual free will choice to fast during Lent, then actually we can go days and days and days and days and days without feeling any need to eat at all. And this is a profound different experience, profoundly different. And it's the power of the free will that does this. Our free will is able to give us the strength to achieve this merely by virtue of choice. And we find that fasting by virtue of free will, which is a spiritual exercise, is actually incredibly easy. It's astonishingly easy to do. But it must be made upon the right basis of our free will and the nature of our desire to cooperate with God. So this idea of our free will then is crucially important, and it's what our meditation practice is teaching us and helping us to learn to do, and helping us to trust that our free will, when it's engaged properly, not in having to fight the ego, but in merely sidestepping the ego and saying that the ego's power is irrelevant to us, that it is our free will in God that is more powerful and more capable and therefore more easy to do. So during our meditation then, we seek to engage in learning how to manifest our free will so that we may choose to cooperate with God. It's a lovely thing to experiment with, and if we try and supplant the ego, we know it's very, very difficult. But try the other way around. Try engaging our free will and saying to ourselves in a moment of spiritual quietness, I choose to do this in cooperation with God. And it's God's power that becomes working within us, that is manifest within us. Not our own power, not any effort on our own part, but it's God's power. He brings his own power to bear when we, of our own free will, choose to align ourselves and cooperate with God. And that means that it becomes so much easier for us to do it. So let us engage in our free will in that spiritual sense and allow God's power to be at work within us during our meditation, that we may free ourselves from all those pressures and distractions that are forced upon us by our life's experience and our ego. Let us experience our free will engagement with God and benefit from that, and experience the joy and positivity of that, because that is what we are made for. God has given us the capacity to be able to cooperate with God in making ourselves better and more spiritual, and dare I say more holy than we currently are. So I hope that this particular reflection on our meditation practice has brought some new ideas and some new encouragement to you in the coming days of Lent, as we prepare ourselves to be able to celebrate the crucifixion, death and resurrection of our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ, that we may be part of that same process, that we may be resurrected through our free will intention to cooperate with God in this act of prayer, this act of devotion, this act of self-sacrifice. So thank you all for joining me, and I once again apologise for the technical errors that have caused us to have this split recording of our meditation session this evening. And so if you were late in coming to the second part of this session today, then thank you for being able to join us, and you can come back later if needs be. So God bless you all and keep you safe.